I'll introduce Nigel Dodds, the author of the bill, who's going to say something about his bill and the arguments he's going to be putting forward tomorrow on the floor of the House of Commons. Nigel.
Thanks very much indeed, Mark, for that introduction. The single biggest issue, I believe, in British politics today is the issue of the breakdown in trust between the British people and the political classes. And one of those issues is the issue of Europe and our relationship with the European Union. And of course, over the years we have seen, haven't we, a steady erosion of the powers of this Parliament and the transfer of those powers to the European institutions. But the Lisbon Treaty is, I believe, one of the most significant issues that has been dealt with in any Parliament in the last number of decades. And we have had, unfortunately, passed by some 138 votes in second reading, a bill implementing the Lisbon Treaty, and as has been said, without a referendum, without the British people being asked for their opinion, despite the promise that was given by the Liberal Democrats, despite the promise that was given by the Conservative Party, and despite the promise given by the Labour Party that indeed the people would have their say. And why have the people been denied their say? They have been denied their say out of fear. The fear on the part of the ruling parties and the political classes that in fact the people will say no to the European project and to greater federalism and to the provisions contained in the in the Lisbon Treaty. Based, of course, on what they saw happen in France, first of all, and then in Holland, where the peoples of those two nations rejected the European Constitution, and then, of course, latterly in the Irish Republic, where the people again rejected Lisbon, and then after again much wheedling and subterfuge, people were dragooned, basically frightened and bullied into voting for the Lisbon Treaty the second time around, just as they were on the Nice Treaty previously. So it is the breakdown in trust, it is the trust issue, which is the central reason, I believe, why this bill is important and why I believe it must be introduced. Because this is what is at the centre of the demand for a referendum. That if we're going to restore trust in Parliament, then the main parties and politicians, the government and the opposition must be held to account to keep the promise they made to the British people. And that is absolutely essential, therefore, that this is put to them. As has been mentioned there, and I'll not repeat what has been said by Gordon Brown previously and by David Cameron. David Cameron's famous reference on the 26th of September, his cast iron guarantee that if he became Prime Minister, a Conservative government will hold a referendum on any EU treaty that emerges from these negotiations. And he repeated that pledge, it seems to have been forgotten, during the European election campaign as late as May 2009, only for him to renege on that pledge in November 2009. Now, he indicates and says that there are other ways forward. I believe that his plan to seek the repatriation of powers in a number of fields, such as employment and social affairs and other areas, will come to nothing, quite frankly, unless there is a referendum held which ensures that those going into negotiations have the clout and have the authority of the decision of the British people behind them when they go into negotiate. The fact of the matter is, how on earth are you going to persuade the member states, such as Germany and France, or the European Commission, or anybody else, that you're serious and that you intend to negotiate to get the best deal possible, if you've already thrown away the referendum card and you're relying on some kind of pledge and manifesto? It simply is not credible to believe that those people will take you seriously. You need to have the referendum, you need to have the votes of the British people behind you in order to give your negotiators any kind of strength to actually achieve the result. And of course, the other main reason why we need a referendum is that it ensures that these negotiators and the government are kept honest. Because it's very easy to go into negotiations and then come back from those negotiations and tell Parliament and tell people that you know, if there hasn't been a referendum, that certain things have been achieved. It's much more difficult to do that if the British people have already voted, and you have to come back and report on the outcome of those negotiations after a referendum has been held. So for those reasons, it's absolutely essential that we have the referendum that was promised to us. David Cameron has talked about legislating to guarantee that any future transfers of power to Europe will have to be approved in a referendum. Well, that's all very good. But the fact of the matter is that all the building blocks necessary to create a European superstate are already in place. If we don't have a referendum on this treaty, and on this European constitution, which is effectively what it is, then all the promises about the future are meaningless. And in any case, as we know, within the Lisbon Treaty is contained a provision which allows amendments and changes to take place without any reference necessarily to any future governmental agreements and the decision of member states. The so-called passerelle provisions and others. So that is meaningless in my view. He talks about legislating to guarantee the primacy of British law over the European Union. And the difficulty, of course, with that is that the Lisbon Treaty itself, again, as enshrined now, confirms the primacy of EU law over United Kingdom law. And who resolves disputes when there are disputes? The European Court of Justice, which has as its central objective the promotion of European integration. So again, I believe that there are difficulties with all of that. The only way forward, therefore, is to have a referendum now and to ensure that those who go in to negotiate have the strength of the British people behind them. There are some who have said to me, well, you know, a referendum isn't the way that that the British Parliament and British democracy and British society operates, that we don't operate by referendums and so on. Well, of course, the only national referendum we've had was on the common market. And of course that was held in 1975 after we had already joined the common market. So some people say, well, you can't have a referendum now since the Lisbon Treaty has already been ratified. Well, what about the 1975 referendum? We'd already joined the common market. Are we saying therefore that was illegitimate and invalid? Of course these things are all about politics. These are about making sure that things can actually be brought about, not the legal technicalities. I believe that in a situation where the British people had voted very decisively that they did not agree with the decision to ratify the Lisbon Treaty, then of course Europe has to sit up and listen to that when any British government goes in to negotiate on that basis. So ladies and gentlemen, it is absolutely essential that we put this issue before Parliament. It's absolutely essential that the British people are reminded in all parts of the United Kingdom of the promises that were made by the government, by the opposition, by the Liberal Democrats. It's absolutely essential that we make it clear that there are still people in Parliament and outside Parliament who believe that it is absolutely essential that trust is restored between people and Parliament and politics, and the way to do that is to ensure that people are kept to their promises and that promises are honoured. So even if tomorrow we may not succeed in having this piece of legislation necessarily passed, even by a small majority, I have no doubt that there will be those there who will try to ensure that it's talked out and so on and so forth, as most of these private bills are. Nevertheless, we have set down an important marker. We will have made sure that Parliament has been presented with the opportunity on this matter, and I have absolutely no doubt that we will return to this issue in the next Parliament. And it's absolutely essential that we do not simply roll over and give up on these major constitutional issues. And certainly for my part, our party, small as it is, although we have 8 members of Parliament at the moment, and given the way the polls are going, and today's most recent opinion poll, which shows a Tory lead of some 6%, the third in a row, which shows the possibility, very strong possibility, of a hung Parliament, I believe 8 votes could turn out to be very important indeed. And I know that our priorities will be in the next Parliament. Thank you very much.